Thank you, Tom, for the invitation. I participated in the last few days, and the vibe in the hall is quite amazing. And I envy you that I was not able to join you, but at least I have a feeling of it, and I'm delighted to present my paper here. In the field of biblical studies in general, and in the study of the Pentateuch in particular, contradictions, duplications, repetitions, and inconsistencies are often treated as clear indicators of a composite text drawn from multiple sources. Today, a wide range of theoretical approaches exists for identifying and characterizing these sources and their interrelationships. However, despite the methodological diversity, these approaches, to varying degrees, rest on the foundational assumption that textual regularities reflect editorial layering and the compilation of different documents. These assumptions developed in an academic environment where literary theory was still in its infancy and where historical critical methods dominated the analysis of literature. Since then, the field of literary studies has undergone significant transformation. Modern literary theory has frequently interpreted repetition, roughness, and even contradiction not as editorial failings, but as sophisticated literary devices. These perspectives have been applied to biblical studies as well, particularly through what are called synchronic approaches, but rarely have the inconsistencies viewed as literary strategies as opposed to redactional indicators. Here I propose the question: to what extent are textual repetitions, duplications, and inconsistencies deliberate literary strategies consciously and extensively employed by the biblical authors? This question requires a broad examination of multiple Torah texts, impossible to undertake in one short paper. I will focus on a single text, Exodus 1, verses 8 to 22. Although this passage is not particularly difficult from a textual standpoint, it provides an illustration of the kind of analysis I propose. The narrative of Israel enslavement in Egypt begins in Exodus verses 8 to 22 and serves as a prologue to the Exodus stories chapters 2 to 15. Pharaoh expresses anxiety over the numerical growth of the Israelites and fears their potential alliance with Egypt's enemies, which could lead to their departure from the land. Verses 9-10. In response, he proposes their subjugation as a strategic solution to the perceived threat. Verses 10-11. Pharaoh's concern about the Israelites' multiplication tied to the possibility that they might join Egypt's enemies in warfare. However, the text also notes that his concern is that they will go up from the land, verse 10. This raises a logical question. If Pharaoh views the Israelites as a potential internal threat, would it not be his interest for them to leave? Why then is their departure presented as part of the problem? The narrative presents two distinct strategies devised by Pharaoh. The first involves subjugating the Israelites to hard labor, and the second entails the killing of the all newborn Israelite boys. Correspondingly, the passage is divided into two sections. Verses 8 to 14 describe Pharaoh's initiative to afflict the Israelites with oppressive labor, and verses 15 to 22 detail the subsequent order to eliminate the Hebrew male infants. It remains unclear how Pharaoh envisioned that the forced labor would resolve the issues of Israel's demographic growth. Is it possible to discern a coherent logic behind Pharaoh's plan? Similarly, the rationale behind Pharaoh's decision to target male infants for death is also difficult to grasp. If his objective was to maximize the labor force, the extermination of male children would be counterproductive. Conversely, if he sought to curb Israel's population growth, it would arguably be more effective to kill both male and female infants. These tensions in Pharaoh's reasoning will be addressed further on. I would like to focus the relationship between Pharaoh's two decrees. What is the connection between his initial policy of the forced labor and his later command to kill the Israelite males? Do these represent a coherent escalation in policy, or do they reflect different dimensions in Pharaoh's strategy? I will first explore a few possibilities according to the documentary hypothesis theory. I will color the biblical text. J will be blue, E will be purple, and P will be red for the convenience of all of us. The dominant scholarly view attributes the initiative for enslavement of Israel to J. According to this position, verses 8 to 12 are the work of J. The theme Ina, affliction, continues the words of Genesis 15, verse 13. The words Hava, come let us, in verse 10, also appears in J text, for instance, Genesis 11, 6, 7, as does the word son'enu. Moreover, the word play on Yosef, verse 8, and Venosaf is characteristic of the style of J. In contrast, the decree to kill the male infants is generally attributed to E. Verses 15 to 21 are attributed to E based on the use of the divine name Elohim, verses 17 and 20, the designation of the king of Egypt, which is typical to their source, as noted by North, and the phrase Yirat Elohim, fear of God, which is also characteristic of E, prop, page 138. The main argument for distinguishing verses 15-21 from verses 8 to 12 is the discrepancy in the implied size of the Israel population. In verses 8 to 12, the people are described as exceedingly numerous, where in the second section, the number appear much smaller, so much so that only 2 midwives are sufficient to attend to all Israelite births. Prop, page 126. Verses 13-14 function as a duplication of the enslavement description found in verses 8 to 12. There's a broad consensus that these two verses belong to the priestly source, primarily due to the distinctive vocabulary. According to this source-critical division, E lacks Pharaoh's explicit motivation for seeking the destruction of the Hebrew infants, an omission likely due to the editorial intervention. If most of the material in Exodus 1, 15 to 22 is attributed to E, the narrative in Exodus chapter 2, verses 1 to 10 is lacking the reason why Moses was put in the basket in the river. Consequently, scholars who assigned Exodus 1 to 10 to J are compelled to attribute verse 22 in chapter 1 to J as well. Conversely, those who view Pharaoh's command to cast the male infants into the Nile, verse 22, as a direct continuation of verses 15 to 21, must also attribute chapter 2, verses 1 to 10 to E for the sake of narrative coherence. For instance, driver. Although there is a considerable scholarly variation regarding the precise delineation of the sources, this division is accepted by many leading scholars, including Carpenter and Battersby, Driver, North, Prop. Nevertheless, this division is not definitive, and 2 main alternative source-critical models have been proposed. One is Van Seters, and before him, Rudolph, argues that the verses 8 to 12 and 15 to 22 belong to J. In his view, the occurrence of the divine name Elohim in the passage is a weak criterion for attributing it to E. And conversely, he rightly observes the continuity between the phrase Rav ve'atzum in verse 20 and the earlier appearance in verse 9. Richard Friedman adopts an opposing approach, attributing verses 8 to 12 and 15 to 22 to E. His primary reason is that the reference to the taskmasters, Sarei Misim, in verse 11, aligns with E's criticism towards Solomon, who imposed forced labor upon the northern tribes. Additional arguments supporting this attribution includes the phrase, the people numerous in the burdens, verse 9 and 11, which also appears in Exodus 5, a passage associated with E. Similarly, the expression, and they were discussed because of the children of Israel, vayakutu mipnei bnei Israel, recurs in Numbers 22, verse 3, a verse likewise attributed to E. However, both Van Seters and Friedman do not address the relationship between Pharaoh's two decrees. According to all approaches above, none of the sources displays complete internal consistency, and within each passage, there are no definitive features that can be attributed unequivocally to a particular source. Because of lack of time, I will only mention 3 points. A widely accepted attribution of verses 13-14 to P is not without difficulty. Carpenter, for instance, argues that verse 14 is essentially a repetition of verse 13, and that the phrase harsh labor, avodah kasha, in verse 14 is characteristic of J. Thus, he attributes the first part of verse 14 to J. Second point, Pharaoh commands his people to throw every newborn Hebrew male into the Nile, appears to contradict the earlier command to the midwives. Thus, some separate verse 22 to a different source. 3. A phrase in verse 20, the people multiplied and became very strong, cannot belong to A, as its language and style align with J, particularly echoing verse 9. Therefore, scholars who assign the passage to E often argue that the specific words should be attributed to J. Those who argue that both decrees stem from a single source did not adequately explain the relationship between them. They focused on Pharaoh's fears of the Israelite overpopulation as the motivation for the decree to kill the newborns. But there remains no clear explanation as to why Pharaoh initially began with enslavement. On the other hand, those who viewed the two decrees as originating from separate sources arrived at a stranger conclusion. Pharaoh enslaved the Israelites due to their demographic growth, but no motive is provided for the decree to kill the infants. The analysis presented here suggests that the source-critical division of the text remains far from clear. As Childs summarized in his commentary on page 4, I quote, "The usual criteria for the divine name or duplicated story occur too infrequently to be of aid," unquote. Even if the narrative is based on multiple sources, it is evident that all 3 stands, or 2, have undergone significant editorial revision by a redactor who intentionally integrated the various traditions. This appears to have been done to generate a new layer of meaning, one that cannot be uncovered by adhering strictly to the classic documentary hypothesis. It seems necessary, therefore, to seek an alternative interpretive path. I propose here a literary method with a focus on the narrative structure in its current form to better understand the relationship between the 2 decrees of Pharaoh's underlying objectives in issuing each one. Contrary to the assumption often made by scholars, verses 13-14 do not merely repeat what is stated in verses 8-12, but rather represent a progression and intensification of the enslavement. Verses 13-14 expand the scope of the oppression in several ways. First, while the earlier labor benefited Pharaoh alone, verse 14 refers to labor of the field, suggesting that the Israelites were now enslaved by the general Egyptian population and compelled to perform a wide variety of tasks. Second, the intensity of labor is amplified, whereas verse 11 uses the phrase to afflict them with burdens, verses 13-14 introduce the terms harsh labor, befarech, and made their lives bitter, vayemararu et chayehem, further emphasizing the cruelty of the enslavement. The closing repetition of the verse 13, they made them serve with rigor, reinforces the intensified nature of their suffering. With this understanding, the narrative flow becomes clearer. In verse 10-11, Pharaoh devises the strategy to subjugate the Israelites. Initially, this takes the form of forced labor in the service of Pharaoh alone, specifically building storage cities. However, this strategy backfires. Despite the hardship, the people continue to multiply. Verse 12. In response, Pharaoh escalates the oppression in verses 13 and 14. The Israelites are now subjected to a broader form of enslavement under harsher conditions to the benefit of the wider Egyptian society. Accordingly, the decree to kill the Hebrew infants in verses 15 to 22 should not be seen as the immediate response to the failure of forced labor. Rather, it was the intensification and expansion of that labor described in verses 13 to 14 that constituted Pharaoh's next step in attempting to control the Israelite population. A similar structural and thematic development occurs in the second part of the narrative concerning Pharaoh's decree to kill the newborn males. After the midwives refused to carry out Pharaoh's command, the text again notes, and the people multiplied and became strong. Vayarev ha'am vayatzmu me'od, verse 20. As with the enslavement, the decree to kill the infants lead to the opposite of Pharaoh's desired outcome. In response, Pharaoh escalates the policy. He no longer limits the task to the Hebrew midwives, but issues a general decree to all his people, verse 22, instructing them to cast every male Hebrew child into the Nile. Although the verse does not explicitly state Hebrew children, the context makes this implication unmistakable. In light of the above analysis, we can discern a deliberate structure in Exodus 1, verses 8 to 22. Each of the two main narrative units is composed of three parts, forming a parallel pattern which can be seen according to the matching colors. The structural reading highlights the narrative symmetry and progression. Each section opens with a royal initiative, follows with its failure or resistance, and concludes with a harsher or more extreme response. The effectiveness of this structural division becomes clearer when examining the parallel between the second components of the first and second sections. Following the imposition of forced labor, Pharaoh's plan to reduce the Israelite population fails. Paradoxically, the more they are oppressed, the more they multiply. Verse 12. This unexpected result intensifies Egyptian anxiety and fear of the Israelite. As with the decree of the forced labor, Pharaoh's command to kill the male infants yields the opposite effect. Instead of being reduced in number, the Israelites grow even stronger, defying his intent. Verse 10. A striking parallel emerges between the two parts. The escalation in both the enslavement and the decree to kill the male infants involves the participation of the broader Egyptian population. In verse 13, the Israelites are forced to serve all the Egyptians. In verse 22, every Egyptian is now authorized to kill Hebrew boys. Thus, the narrative presents a movement from Pharaoh's personal initiative to national complicity. This development lays the groundwork for the later themes of collective punishment and redemption, where the entire Egyptian nation becomes implicated in Israel's oppression, and in turn, the divine acts of judgment and liberation that follow. This analysis challenges the common assumption that Pharaoh's decree to kill the male infants was a direct response to the failure of forced labor to reduce the Israelite population. Rather than viewing the infanticide and corrective measure, it is more accurate to see it as an independent initiative, one of two complementary strategies designed to achieve Pharaoh's overreaching goal. When Pharaoh saw the Israelites continue to multiply despite their oppression, verse 12, he did not abandon the project of enslavement, but instead intensified it. Therefore, it seems unlikely that the killing of the infants was a reaction to the limited success of enslavement. Instead, each decree serves as a distinct purpose within Pharaoh's broader policy. To understand the narrative's presentation of two separate decrees, one must grasp the theological significance of each. I propose that each decree directly contradicts a fundamental divine promise found in the book of Genesis. God makes two central promises to the patriarchs. First, the promise of numerous descendants, like the stars of the sky and the sand on the seashore. And the second, the promise of land for their offspring. Pharaoh's decrees appear to target both. The enslavement of the Israelites represent a negation of the land promise, reducing the Israelites to a nation of slaves, devoid of autonomy and tied to Egypt. Pharaoh severs their connection to the land of Canaan and their capacity to become a free nation. The second decree, to kill every newborn Hebrew boy, is a direct assault of the promise of numerous offspring. Pharaoh's policies thus stand in stark opposition to the divine plan, turning him into the theological antithesis of God. This reading also clarifies Pharaoh's later refusal to let the people leave Egypt. The intent is not only political and economic, it is presented as an ideological and theological. The opening chapter of Exodus is thus structured as a confrontation between the two competing visions of the future of Israel, Pharaoh's and God's. From the outset, Pharaoh is positioned as a foil to God. His policies totally opposed to the divine plan. This narrative framework highlights the depth of the conflict between Egypt and Israel. Pharaoh and the Egyptians do not achieve their aims easily. Both the enslavement and the decree to kill the infants fail to produce the intended result. On the contrary, the Israelites multiply even more. The escalation on both measures reflect Egypt's determination to crush Israel and Israel's remarkable resilience. The exchange between Pharaoh and the Hebrew midwives illustrate this resistance. The midwives display courage and ingenuity, refusing to obey Pharaoh's command because they fear God. Their explanation that Hebrew women are vigorous and give birth before the midwives arrive is transparently implausible, yet Pharaoh accepts it without protest. Far from being punished, the midwives are rewarded by God. This divine reward reflects God's presence in the background of the narrative. Although not visibly active, God's hand is evident. Israel's growth despite oppression, the reward to the midwives, and the ironic ineffectiveness of Pharaoh's decrees all point to divine sovereignty. Pharaoh, though powerful, is rendered almost comical in his inability to subdue Israel, especially when two Hebrew women successfully defy him. Thus, the first chapter of Exodus sets the stage for the broader narrative conflict between the oppressor and oppressed, tormentor and tormented. It subtly introduces God as the ultimate sovereign whose will prevail. This chapter also presents the motivation for the Exodus. Israel's oppressions fuel the drive for liberation. Pharaoh's attempt to prevent the fulfillment of God's promises to the patriarchs becomes the very means through which those promises are realized. In this lecture, I sought to demonstrate how duplications and inconsistencies in Exodus 1 function as literary devices employed to convey a complex and profound meaning. Rather than serving as indicators of multiple sources or editorial layers, such repetitions and redundancies in the narrative should be understood as narrative tools that generate meaning within the text itself. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Elie, for that very elegant and sophisticated reading of the text. We have time for a couple of questions. I have a lot of questions too, if anyone else. Yes, Philip.
Thank you, Elie, for the question. Can you hear me?
Yes, yes, I can.
Okay, thank you. So EXODUS1, as you showed with source critical solutions, like we're talking about blocks of text, right, that were put together. I'm wondering how you would apply what you have discussed to a text that is more integrated, like EXODUS14, where source critics see a lot more of like this, if you could see me,
yes.
like rather than this. Like, so yeah, just curious to hear thoughts on EXODUS14.
Yeah, well, that deserves a full additional paper, not in 1 second, but there are different literary strategies that are used by biblical authors. So if you refer to EXODUS14, then I would just use one term, and maybe we'll talk about it later. We're talking about different points of view of the text, where different points of view are mentioned in different ways, and sometimes even in contradiction. Points of view, if two people see one object, they might see it in a very different way, and even conflicting way, but still they might be within the same text. So I can give you one example that you can read of. I did this work you have a similar thing as EXODUS14 in Joshua 3 and 4 in a paper written. So maybe we can just discuss this later on.
It sounds good. I actually want to hear Ron's question as well. So yeah, thank you.
Any other questions from the audience? Yeah, I loved many of the themes that you brought up. The Pharaoh as the antithesis of Yahweh in the plot structure, I think is marvelous. And let me just say, I think we could have a whole conference on the issues that you raised, and they're very fruitful and generative. Let me ask you, is some of the literary art possibly a work of a redactor, or are you suggesting that this is one continuous text that has this immanent structure by one author? Or do you care about the answer to that question?
No, I do care about the answer. Again, it's an excellent question, but I think that there isn't one answer. I think that in many cases, we might be talking about a sophisticated author that presented a multi-dimensional text. In other cases, it might be a result of a reductor. It's also very difficult to determine because if we're talking about an inconsistency that can be the work, a literary device, then it's very difficult to determine if it was done by an author or by a reductor. And maybe, as you mentioned, maybe it doesn't matter so much. But still, I think that both possibilities are an option, a good option.
Beautiful. Elie, thank you so much for this wonderful paper. I really appreciate it. And we all really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.